The topic of data marketplaces is far from being mature and still gives rise to new research issues and practical questions. My name is Gottfried Vossen. I have been a professor of computer science in the Department of Information Systems at the University of Muenster since 1993. Yeah, we did a couple of studies in the area of data marketplaces. It was an area that became interesting in roughly 10, 12 years ago. Our first study was in 2012, and we started examining what is happening in the area where data is traded on a marketplace. So a marketplace is essentially a platform where buyers and sellers get together, and this time the object is data or a product that has been derived from data. And we started looking into what is happening there, what are the pricing models, what are the distinguishing factors of the various offerings. And we repeated this study 3 times altogether to see how the market is changing and what is happening in terms of pricing, in terms of price models, in terms of dimensions, in terms of applications. Where is the data going that is offered on a data marketplace? And that brought us into a couple of interesting conclusions. And one of the conclusions is that there are essentially 2 ways of address a market. One is that the buyer has an idea of what data he's interested in, and he tries to specify the idea in terms of a query, essentially like you query a database in a common language like SQL. The other side is that the seller often has a fixed price, and then either the buyer is taking that price or he has to leave it. That led to the conclusion that looking at how to query a data market might be an interesting thing. So the second conclusion that we drew from the various studies is that a data marketplace, for the moment, for the time being, is not really a marketplace in a common sense. That this is a platform where price negotiations happen between buyers and sellers. And that led us to looking into the question of pricing. So what is a good idea for the seller to set a price, and what is a good idea for the buyer to accept a price or to ask for a better price? So from the seller's perspective, the question is, how much is the data worth for the buyer? The problem is that the seller doesn't know this in advance, and therefore he can only guess the value of the data for the seller and maybe vary the price depending on knowledge that he can obtain. On the other side, for the buyer, the question is, how much do I know about the data before I actually pay for it? And that is somehow a paradox, because the buyer would be willing to pay a price as soon as he can be sure that the value is what he is actually looking for. But that would imply that he gets the data for free. And this is the kind of balance that has to be found. And we looked into various solutions to setting a price and thereby solving this particular problem. So one of the solutions was an approach that we named Name Your Own Price. So the idea is that the buyer has an idea of how much he wants to spend on the data, and the seller says, okay, I'm willing to accept this price, however, you only get a certain version of the data that I have. Another approach, which is also interesting, is the question of what can we say about querying. So in a very simple form, we can think of a data marketplace as a database to which the buyer has no access, but the buyer is able to send certain queries to the database, and the seller can then decide whether or not he wants to answer the queries. And so pricing could also be bound to the queries. And that, by the way, leads to a totally different area that leads to the question of how to charge for resources used in response to a query. So suppose that the query involves a complex computation, then the data marketplace actually has to perform the computation, and often this requires quite an amount of computing time. And of course that could be somehow become the basis for pricing. Similarly, and this is a new area that I plan to look into in the future, is the more general, the question of energy consumption. This is something that nobody has looked into so far, and it seems for me a promising area for future research.